I think just to start, I mean, I think especially in the social ecological space, a lot of the framing for the work on resilience is this idea that we live in the Anthropocene, which is defined as this new geological era in which human activity is having a major impact on Earth system dynamics, not just sort of local and regional impacts, but really on the Earth system functioning at a global scale. Just briefly, the Anthropocene is proposed to geologically now be starting around the mid-1900s, and this has to do with where we can pick up markers in the geological record, and I think one of the big ones is nuclear fallout, but there's also other things like new kinds of rocks, like plastic agglomerate, that we'll be able to find a long time in the future. And I also like this one, the Anthropocene chicken, because our chickens have drastically increased in size, and these bones will also be laid down in the geological record for a long time to come. But I think it's very clear that the Anthropocene and these impacts are an outcome, and they obviously clearly very deeply rooted in our modern systems of market-based production and consumption. And for this reason, there's also been arguments that potentially another term or way of thinking about this is the idea of the capitalism. And I think that also lends itself to kind of emphasizing some different dynamics here. And I think the other thing to recognize here is that, the Anthropocene, there's also been lots of debate about when it really started. Clearly, this is an emergent outcome from a long process that's been accumulating over time. So clearly, the Industrial Revolution has had a major impact in terms of where we're at today, but there's also been the big changes that happened during the Renaissance, and I think some people even argue going back all the way to the Agricultural Revolution is really what set the scene for where we're at today. But despite this kind of long history of changes that humanity has made to the planet, I think what is also interesting is that these changes and the scale and speed at which we're seeing these changes has really increased since the 1950s, and we see this in a broad range of socio-economic trends, and I think people are quite familiar with these, and they're also reflected in a lot of the Earth system trends around the planet. I won't dwell on these, but then just maybe to summarize, I think this gives rise to a lot of key challenges that we face today, and I think some of the key ones is this idea that sort of from an Earth system perspective, we're pushing the limits of how the planet has been functioning, particularly in terms of the kind of Holocene-like state in which complex kind of modern societies have arisen and in which we've been functioning. We're kind of pushing right at the envelope of those dynamics, and we don't quite know what that could mean in terms of the conditions under which we're living. On the other hand, the current kind of economic system that has largely also kind of given rise to what we see today. I like this picture. We have a massive problem with extreme inequalities. And this is also a very key feature of, I think, the challenges that we're all concerned about. I think another big issue here is also the role of technology, and this is coming up in, I think, a lot of spaces now, but especially this idea that it's increasing the connectivity, but also the speed of change. And this is leading to a lot of completely novel and unexpected effects. And a lot of the things that are happening are, before we even realize they're happening, and they're happening at a kind of a speed that is very difficult to actually develop any kind of effective responses to. And I think the other thing from sort of the social ecological perspective is also that we see at least quite a lot of the crises we're seeing have clear interconnections between the environment and markets and society. So we've got kind of these big global interconnected, fast-moving, novel kind of challenges that we're facing. And then just lastly on that, at least personally from the kind of my beliefs and the work I'm doing, I think that a lot of the context we're facing is not just that we have these increasing changes that we need to respond to, but that we face a more fundamental challenge, which is, I think, potentially meeting the kind of challenges we face here may require a much deeper and very fundamental reorganization of our societies and economies. And I think this is also where a lot of the work on transformation is now heading towards. But it may be something on kind of the order of the kind of change we saw so in Europe from medieval to industrial times. So it's really a fundamental shift in the way we understand the nature of the world and our place in the world. and how those ways of understanding the world shape our choices and the institutions we build in society and our economies, etc. So I think at the bigger scale, to me, this is at the deeper challenge. So the way I see resilience, especially in the social ecological space, but I think it's actually possibly broad in quite a lot of fields, is that this is one emerging concept to deal with these kind of challenges that have now emerged as part of this condition of the Anthropocene. And it has to do a lot with building capacity to deal with change. And this can be novel change, unexpected change, or more gradual change that is happening. But a lot of these changes are things that are completely unprecedented and we haven't seen before, and we're not quite sure how to deal with them. And I think this is a lot of the interest in resilience. And then it's been argued, and I think from quite a lot of scholars, that, and I think this is also where there's quite a lot of interest in this term, is this feeling that there's the potential of this concept to help reframe our thinking and planning, especially to be better able to deal with change, uncertainty, unknowability, and normativity. And I think a lot of the way that we've been approaching science before is actually trying to figure out how things work and then plan around that. And this is actually a different way of thinking, is how do we have capacity to deal with things that we can't figure out and can't predict that are going to happen. And I think a lot of, at least from my perspective, I think, and I think quite a few authors are arguing that this kind of potential that resilience has is a lot to do with building on this growing understanding of the nature of complex adaptive systems and how we can think about managing them. And at a broader level, I think this is linked to ideas around potentially a kind of deeper paradigm shift that might be happening or could happen in society, linked to these ideas around complexity and the way that it changes our conception of the nature of reality and our place as humans in the world. So it has quite deep roots, this resilience concept. But as Shiona mentioned, there's been a very rapid expansion, especially recently in the use of resilience, and it's being applied across a very diverse set of fields. And I think there's been quite a lot of bibliometric studies now looking at, where is this work being done. And you can see I've just listed some of the fields that have been mentioned there. And I think also just to mention, and I think that's Vinyo where it's got way out of academia, but is being used in a lot of practical settings by big institutions around the world. And it's driving funding investments and development activities. And when we then also look, and I think most of these papers you'll look at, there'll be big tables of definitions of resilience. So they're very diverse definitions. And these are between different fields, but even within fields, there are a lot of different definitions. And some of these are based more on complexity ideas than others. But this is, I think, part of the confusion that's out there as well. I think even within the area of global environmental change, there are also very different strands of work on resilience, and they're also based on different assumptions and different ways of doing things. I quite like this categorization. It kind of also makes sense to me in terms of the kind of work I really come into contact with more frequently. But I think in this paper, they also did an interesting analysis of the conceptual progression of the term resilience within these different sort of fields within global environmental change. And they highlighted that the social-ecological resilience space has been especially a space that has embraced these ideas around complexity and has actually been a little bit at the forefront of conceptual development that then partly gets taken up in some of the other fields over time. But I think that also means we have people are also using different definitions from kind of different eras in different spaces. And I'll get back to that a bit later. I then just like this graph that I found in this Euro paper. That basically also just re-emphasizes this point. So they looked at studies that had both the words resilience or resiliency or something and complexity, and then they did this co-citation network. So it's looking at all papers that they have both those kind of keywords in their titles, but then look at to what extent are those set of papers cited together in studies. And what we see here is that they've kind of identified 5 communities that are using the ideas around resilience and complexity. And there's this big cluster here around basically ecology, marine systems, and the social ecological systems. And then the smaller one that's quite separate a different kind of community around complexity and networks, and then a very small community here around organizational risk and resilience. And I think also, if you can't see it here, but if you actually look at the dates of these papers, there's definitely a bit of a shift towards a lot of the recent work is happening in the social ecological space in terms of some of the complexity ideas. So then I thought it might be useful, because I wasn't talking so much about social ecological resilience, to maybe just say a little bit more on some of the key assumptions, at least from my point of view. And I think this is very much based on ideas around complexity. So a basic assumption here is that the social and ecological aspects of the world are very deeply intertwined. And there's also the kind of starting point that the biosphere underpins at least some very key aspects of human well-being that cannot be substituted easily. Secondly, I think there's a big recognition of these interconnections, just not just within a local place or city, but really across scales and across time. And this idea and recognition that all system boundaries are radically open. So we have to make choices about where we define the system, but there will always be many, many influences from outside, and that system will also influence larger systems. Then thirdly, the idea that social ecological systems are complex adaptive systems, and so they are subject to these emergent effects that we cannot predict from understanding the parts, and they're also subject to big nonlinear tipping points, which is also a lot of the work I've been doing. And so we cannot understand these systems by just looking at the different components, and I think that's especially a challenge in terms of the separation between the natural and social sciences, and also that these, because they are complex adaptive systems, we can only ever partially understand or control them. So it's not something that we can figure out and then manage. We have to have some different strategies. Then just getting to the end of this, also I think this view emphasizes that these complex adaptive systems are continuously adapting and changing. So even if we did figure out some pieces of them, they could also change again. And anything that we do, we need to have really a very reflective and also humble approach to thinking about how we go about trying to kind of navigate change. And we need to continuously try to reflect and learn on what is going on in the system. And then I think lastly, that's also very important, is that it's not, I think it's not a totally conservative approach here, is that there's the idea that there are key aspects of our systems that we want to maintain, but also things that may need to drastically change. And that often crises are actually these opportunities for change, because you actually have some kind of loosening up of the system or shifting power, and so you can actually bring about some changes. Okay, then I want to kind of step back again to a little bit more the conceptual side, is also this idea that the resilience is being used in very different ways within and even within the social ecological systems field. And I find that even within a single paper by an author, they can often use the term actually in different ways. And I think this is really also part of the confusion. And at least in my thinking, I've kind of identified three kind of broad ways that I think people are using it. So some of the original definitions have really been about this resilience as a system property that you can maybe measure, and that I think especially goes back to some of the original Harding definitions in the 1970s, and some of the work that's kind of built on that. Then there's a lot of people, and I think even quite a lot of the work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where I used to be based, are actually thinking of resilience kind of more as a broad approach and framework for investigating systems. And so it's not specifically looking at tipping points. So, I mean, some people, they don't even really believe so much in tipping points. So there's also quite a mix there. And then I think in terms of a lot of the kind of practical application, people are actually thinking of resilience as an outcome or a goal. And that's a very normative kind of framing of resilience. And there's really, I find, a very big mix with people using these three different ways of thinking about resilience, and often in the same paper. And so there's also been a lot of critiques, and I think some of these are also very important for thinking about how we progress in the concept. So I think this has been a useful set of ideas that came out in terms of this tension between the original descriptive ideas of resilience and then this idea of using it kind of as a broad approach that helps facilitate dialogue between different fields. But the danger there being that it just becomes quite vague and not very practical. And I think this has also been then sort of leveled at critique, specifically in terms of how the concept is being applied in particular settings, and that it may become a means for people to kind of justify anything that they want to do. So also just to come back to this idea of the conceptual development, I think it's also useful to actually look at the kind of advances over time. And so some of the early work, and you also see that in ecology, was actually very mathematical in terms of resilience. And it really has to do with the ability, if you think also sort of on engineering infrastructures, like how much of a storm impact or something can, say, a bridge withstand before it breaks. And this, I think, is important that it had very much a single equilibrium view of nature. It's like things come back to equilibrium or they collapse. And I think then when the concept moved into ecology, it was broadened to recognize that actually we can have different kind of equilibria or stable states, and things can move between these different regimes. And this is especially where the concept was very much tied to the idea of tipping points and the early work by Holling. Then I think one thing that I feel hasn't been recognized so much is I feel that actually the concept has also transformed quite radically since it moved into the social ecological system space. And it hasn't just been used in the same way. And I think this especially as it's kind of moved into the space in the 2000s, it's become a lot more about what I would think about as actually much more like different pathways or trajectories of change, rather than thinking you just have these kind of different stable states. So it's more about pathways of development. And then it also becomes increasingly more normative. And now obviously it's moving into many other domains. Just to summarize that, I think this was going to be a very useful aspect of this paper, is this idea that originally a lot of the concepts were very much about systems or recovery. Then we had a lot of focus on broadening that out to say systems also need to adapt to change, not just be able to kind of withstand it. And then lastly, I think now especially there's a lot of emphasis on these ideas of transformation and how do we innovate and transform fundamental aspects of our system while maintaining core features that are desirable. So then I wanted to just come to this paper that I found recently that I think is also quite interesting in trying to draw together some of these different definitions. But I think even if you look across these very many different definitions, there is this commonality that resilience really has to do with the capacity of a system to cope with disturbance and change, whether it's sudden or more gradual. And I think across this literature and building on this conceptual progression, there's sort of three ways in which a resilient system, copes with disturbance or change. The first one is that it withstands this change. So this is much more of a kind of resistance set of ideas. Then there's the idea of recovery. So you could have some shock, but maybe you recover, say after a flood or something, but you still kind of go back a bit to what you had. And then the third one is around this transformation to a new condition. And to me, that's really where a lot of the work that I'm doing, and quite a lot of work is now also focusing on how do we actually fundamentally transform the underlying dynamics in our system in order to maintain some of the desirable outcomes. And I think this is linked to also some of the ideas around these three R's of resilience, resistance, recovery, and reorientation. And then I think this author proposes this, you could also just think of a system that is not resilient is one that responds to disturbance in a way that leads to less desirable conditions. So than what you had before. So this is already moving quite some ways over time. I also wanted to just flag that I think this actually fits quite a bit with also some of these more recent definitions of social ecological resilience that are also quite far from some of the first definitions of resilience. So they're really focusing on firstly this capacity of social ecological systems to sustain human well-being, so there's a clear kind of outcome in the face of disturbance and change, but by buffering shocks, adapting or transforming different components of the system. Then I also want to just sort of end off with saying that I think in a lot of the work, and this I think is also building on ideas from complexity, is that there's also an emerging recognition, and I think especially as it's been taken into some of the other fields, that there are clear normative dimensions to defining these desired features or key system functions that we want to maintain. And that the resilience approach acknowledges the fundamental interdependence and interrelatedness of all things. However, we can't understand the whole system, and we have to make judgments about what to include or not. And the important thing is that these choices have consequences. And we need to think carefully about the processes that we are engaging in making these choices. And this is especially when we come to measuring resilience. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And I think, as I said before, that accepting that these choices are necessary means that we need to progress with humility, but also in an iterative and reflective way. And we need to draw in the participation of diverse stakeholders. And I think this comes out very nicely in some of the recent work on how should we operationalize resilience. I think this is quite a nice summary of the kinds of aspects people are considering. Firstly, think about resilience of what. So what is the system we're talking about? To what? What are we thinking about as the kinds of disturbances? And often these are quite general. And then I think especially this question, for whom? Who is benefiting by these changes? What should we preserve? And I think this is especially where there are issues of power in the system. And I think very importantly also over what time frame. So we're having things happening over different time scales. And I think just to say this was very similar to, I think, the recent work coming also out of the Stockholm Resilience Centre and the Resilience Alliance with the new Wayfinder process for resilience assessment. This was a very participatory, and I think it's also reflected in this work on what are these capacities for building or principles for building resilience capacities, which also very much focus on aspects of the governance system and having participation and learning. So then just finally, to wrap up, in summary, resilience, I think, potentially offers a way to reframe our thinking and planning, and it's especially associated with some of the current challenges that Anthropocene poses. And I think some of the potential it offers is really through building on insights from complexity theory. And at the moment, the social-ecological systems field seems quite a hotspot of where a lot of this work is happening. I think this is really important to emphasize because I also see people are using all kinds of definitions, but there's really been substantial conceptual progression, I think, within the field. And one can't just sort of use Holly 1973 because things have actually moved on from there. And I think that's actually really important to keep in mind when you're reading some of these classic authors. And then I also think there is important that there are some emerging commonalities, and especially around the recognition of these normative and ethical dimensions of thinking about resilience. And the need for participatory engagement. And then just my final slide was to say, I think for me, one of the big remaining challenges though is, I think resilience thinking is very much focusing on just responding to change, but to what extent can it also help facilitate creating or driving deeper systemic transformation that I think, for me, lies as one of the really core things that needs to happen, or do we need a completely different concept for that? And I'm looking forward to the discussions.